We acknowledge the Ancient Ones, the Greater Shamanic Council of Light, Hermes, both Trismegistus and Seshet, Lady of the Measuring Cord, as above so below, as within so without. We acknowledge Imhotep, architect of the cosmos. May the earth be the mirror of heaven. We acknowledge the sacred order of the Magi, and all throughout history who knew, like now, a turning of the ages. We acknowledge the master builders of Göbekli Tepe and the great shining ones at Cayelin, the courage and knowledge of the Polynesian wayfinders traversing the great oceans. We acknowledge the prophetic traditions of Ezekiel and Daniel, the traditions of Avalon, the Merlin, and the Round Table, the calendric wizardry of the Maya, and the Venus teachings from Mesoamerica, the Jupiter teachings originating in China, and the Vedic lunar mansion traditions, the Babylonian and Sumerian sidereal zodiacs, the brilliant Hellenistic invention of the seasonal zodiac. The Neolithic peoples around the planet, some still today, honoring the sacred connection between the land and the sky. The Tuatha De Danann in Ireland, who created a time of 2,000 years of peace, the builders of Newgrange. My teachers that are not in human form, Mount Shasta, the Grandfather Rock at the Wonderland of Rocks in Joshua Tree, Mount Haleakala on Maui, the Fish Lake Valley, Hierophany, and the sacred landscapes around the planet, the astrosophy of Rudolf Steiner, and the esoteric astrology of DK in the Tibetan, both presaging the shamanic astrology paradigm, and particularly the archetypal visions of C.G. Jung and the cosmology of my mentor, Dane Rudhyar. For these and more we give thanks.
Salutations from space and aloha from Earth, folks. This is Gemini Brett with Daniel Giamario of the Shamanic Astrology Mystery School, here with another episode of the further adventures of Shamanic Astrology. And we're going to talk about precession, which means a backward motion, and that's good because we recorded this episode some time ago and technical glitches have kept it from coming forth, and so we will record again. Daniel, how in the heavens are you?
I'm doing quite wonderfully after having 3 months traveling the world and now back at our new home here outside of Metro Manila. So finally getting some good internet here too to be able to do a good show with you. I hope we're going to be covering a lot of topics, and so one of the things I might just mention right off the top, we're going to be covering, of course, precession, but then the Galactic Alignment, what we like to call it in our school, the turning of the ages, the whole 13th sign issue, also looking at what does it mean to talk about the beginning of the Age of Aquarius. Also, we're going to be looking at the potentially speculating on when would be the beginning or the end of beginning, ending of the entire 26,000-year cycle itself, the precessional cycle itself. So these are all the kinds of topics we're going to be getting into here. And you have some really great visuals on this, which can help prepare the groundwork for our discussion.
And that being said, folks, this most likely will not be a short episode. So hang in with us. You're going to learn a lot. And hopefully this is review for some of you and new news for some of you. And there will be some links here in the description below of further resources to check out provided by Daniel. So precession of the equinoxes. First of all, what is it? And I guess before that, I'm going to share my screen here. And I'll just recommend that actually the Wikipedia article for axial precession, which you'll find if you search precession of the equinoxes, is really quite good. And one thing I love to say is when you look at the history of it, it shows how long it's been known. at least that history shows it's been known, and we can imagine it's been known before. Many attribute it to Hipparchus. And this will show you that the ancient Greeks, and I'm talking about the Hellenistic times where Western astrology in many ways was born, not only from there, but they knew about this precession of the equinoxes. So when we get to this business like this, and were you born under the sign of the Ophiuchus, right? So once again, in modern times, there's been a regurgitation, we could say, a reincarnation of this 13th sign business. Daniel, when was the first time that 13 signs of the zodiac came to your awareness?
Well, there were actually books and speculations on it as far back as the late 60s, early 70s, usually from a different basis than the way it's been happening recently. The reason why this has happened most recently, and I had a big discussion when I was at ESAR about this with a couple of young astrologers that didn't even know about this, that the actual culprit behind this whole issue is the IAU, the International Astronomical Union, which in 1930 decided to officially for the whole world divide the sky up into 88 different constellations, completely overturning many of the ancient traditions regarding the way the constellations operate. And because of what they did in 1930, both astronomers and astrologers unwittingly have bought into this whole thing that somehow that the constellation of Ophiuchus is along the ecliptic. That was never the case until they decided to put a little piece of it along the ecliptic. I think you have some diagrams about how that happened.
Yeah, we will look at a bunch of images over time. So this thing has come around again and around
again, over and over again, sometimes allegedly from NASA, sometimes from sort of non-mainstream astrologers. And then you have people that know a little bit about astrology and they say, oh my God, we now have a different sign and I was born under a different one than I thought. And, people get all like, emotionally upset about this. And it's all based upon this IAU thing. By the way, the IAU is also the group, the international group of the official governing body of astronomers around the world. They're also the ones that came up with the specific definitions about what a planet is, what a dwarf planet is. They were the ones that, quote, demoted Pluto.
Right. And
so the IAU has their finger in a lot of this stuff that if we don't know how this took place, then how do you even begin a conversation about this 13th constellation or sign issue?
Right. One thing I like to say, and I'll just show what I always wear, is that there are 12 and this is why. And that's a story for another time.
Right.
But, the 12 sign thing seems to come around about every 6 months. And it's been heavy recently. Today, by the way, is November 21st, 2016, where I am in Seattle, and the 22nd, where Daniel is in the Philippines, Manila now. And so astrologers, be warned, because you'll hear from your clients, am I still a Scorpio, and am I an Ophiuchus now, and these kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just talk about why that is. And there actually, this time around, was a statement by NASA in their kids zone section speaking about the 13 constellations. And what's very important here, first of all, there's an invitation, if we can suppress the rage that wants to come forth as astrologers resisting this 13th sign. There's an invitation here for astrologers to remember to look to the sky. Because as Daniel will show us as we move along throughout this chapter, that the signs and constellations are different things. And the constellations carry a beautiful energy and essence and story, starry story for us to also connect to. And this is one of the beautiful gifts of the Shamanic Astrology Mystery School. And I do find hidden in this seeming attack on astrology, the invitation to remarry astrology and astronomy. And this is something that hopefully we astrologers will do in our time, yeah?
Yes.
All right, so back to the screen share, and we'll get back to Are you born under the sign of Ophiuchus? This one shared by earthsky.org, one of the great astronomical resources. I highly recommend you sign up for their newsletter. It's something that Daniel and I both watch. This is the one that kind of hurt me most from the spirit science guys, because they do so much work on the flower of life and the seed of life and sacred geometry. And this is where I find the 12 really comes from. But they say that NASA updated the zodiac signs for the first time in 2,000 years. And it's really important to know that NASA didn't do anything about zodiac signs. It's been a while since NASA's been doing anything with zodiac signs. They used to. Remember the Gemini project? And how many Gemini missions were there? 12. All right. They did Mercury, a planet. How many Mercury astronauts were there? 7. Right? So these guys used to be hip. And now they're speaking about signs. They're speaking about constellations. And they're arguing that Ophiuchus is needed to fill in this space that Scorpius does not. And so we will look to that. But first to talk about why this sometimes feels like a big deal. And so I'm going to show a couple things here. Well, first, just look to the chart. This is right now in Seattle, Washington. The late degrees of Cancer are on the rise, Aries at the midheaven. And today, the sun shifted into the fire sign of Sagittarius. So we can see Venus here in Capricorn, Mercury conjunct Saturn in Sagittarius, Mars in Aquarius. I could go on, but what I'm going to show, and I mentioned the Virgo moon as well, what I'm going to show is stellarium and the astronomy of what's happening right now. This is also right now. All right, so here's Mars, and I'm actually going to rewind time, and we'll bring the sun back up into the sky. Zoom in a little bit. So here is the Virgo moon, but in the constellation of the Lion. Here is Libra Jupiter in the constellation of the Priestess. Sun and Mercury and Saturn in Sagittarius, the sign, but in the constellation of the Scorpion. And if I move forward a little bit, we'll see that Aquarius Mars in the constellation of Capricornus. All right, so this is some of the issue that we find courtesy of precession of the equinoxes. People will write in their articles that your star sign is not what you thought it was. Well, the point of the thing is that it's not about the star sign. And what I will say is that the zodiac, the 12-sign zodiac, is a flower that blossoms from the core of Earth. I'm working with some engineers to model this right now, and I look forward to sharing that when it's ready. But the signs which emanate from the Earth of the tropical zodiac that we use as Western astrologers, they're not about the stars necessarily. The stars, the constellations of the zodiac, they help us tell time in a sense. They help us see what sign we are in, if you know the constellational and sign correlation, but they are different things. And it's an invitation again to look up. So I'm going to show one more thing in stellarium, just to show you why NASA decided to bring in this so-called 13th constellation. And again, it's not a 13th sign. NASA right now, at least publicly, is not speaking about signs, but they are speaking about constellations. And the general idea from them is because Scorpius here is so low that there's really no zodiacal or ecliptic essence of Scorpio in this zone of space. And so now they're using Serpentis or Ophiuchus, this cat, to kind of fill that zone because he stands there. And it's a very special place of the sky that we will speak about much today, Galactic Center. But look at how high Ophiuchus is above the ecliptic. In fact, you can never see him in the southern hemisphere. So even this NASA 13th sign is a very northern hemisphere centric point of view. Yes. And also for me, sure, shallow might be pretty low here below the ecliptic, but it's very visible. And so if a planet is here, as Saturn will be, I can just go a year or so into the future. It doesn't require me personally to need Ophiuchus to fill in that hole. I can see that Saturn is aligned to Shaula at the time. Do you agree, Daniel?
Oh, completely. Well, this is what I was referring to before, that it's funny that NASA says they're now making the shift. The shift was made in 1930. When the IAU decided to fill in that space with a box, with a square, with these different lines. And not only did they put in a piece of Ophiuchus along the ecliptic, just because they could. Well, let's do this. But they also did the whole rest of the sky in 88 boxy, strange-shaped kind of things. They decided to impose a certain kind of linear arrangement on the sky when for a much longer time period in history, there was empty space. They didn't feel the need to have to create specific, distinct constellations around the whole sky. So this actually happened in 1930, and NASA is now saying, well, we're now going to finally tell everybody that we needed to fill in that space. But the astronomers had already done that in 1930. And I personally think it's completely bogus. I love what you just said about how that it's even more obvious how bogus it is if you're in the southern hemisphere.
Right, where you can never see that constellation.
And that's without, it's probably beyond the scope of our conversation today. It would be a really fun one to do at some point, more specifically about numbers and sacred geometry itself, which is the tremendous magic of the base 12 system. How that connects in with 360 and the original idea in the Hellenistic and pre-Hellenistic Babylonian times to actually have that way of using numbers to think of much easier than base 10, quite frankly, and certainly easier than 13. And we've talked about this before also, that lest you think 12 is some sort of solar number and 13 is some lunar number, they're actually both equally important numbers for the moon.
Right, and with the so-called Genesis pattern, what we see is 2 6-petaled flowers. 6 petals in and 6 petals out. And they speak to the 12 astrological sign. There is a 13. It's the middle. And that is you. That is us here.
Yeah, exactly. And right. If we have that show at some point, we can bring in the amazing work of Robin Heath and the silver fraction, the 5, 12, 13 triangle that creates the precise fraction of the relationship of the moon and the sun, in the sense of how the moon fits in with the year. There's so much of that in the stone circle. What would you call it, sacred geometry around the planet, but that's all part of another story. What we're saying here, without the proof in this particular show, is that 12 is really important. It's always been really important, and the 12 signs come. The 12 sign system is archetypal. Maybe let's put it that way.
Sure, and the 12 tribes and the 12 apostles and the 12 petals on the Genesis pattern for the flower of life. There's also 12 half steps and a musical octave. And so sacred geometry has been one of my greatest astrology teachers this last year, literally taking the compass into my own hand. It's something I recommend all astrologers do. It's something that I teach and I look forward to sharing in what I call the chart. Music's been a wonderful new essence of my astrological sharing, where I'm literally playing the aspects on the piano, and that's a thing for another time. But when we talk about the 88 constellations, that's fun because there's 88 keys in the piano, and we astronomical astrologers also know that Mercury, who probably brought music to us, has an 88-day orbit about the sun. And so the numbers are beautiful, and we'll speak about the 12. We won't speak so much more about the 13. We'll also speak about 72 today.
Yes. Well, I was just going to say that what the older way of understanding the sky honored the space between the constellational patterns, which is not taken into account in the way that the IAU boxed everything off.
Yeah,
and the Ptolemaic tradition would have as much an importance to the space in between, say, the Archer and the Scorpion, then actually it's important. The space in between was important as the actual shapes themselves.
Absolutely. And we'll look to some of those boundaries as we move along here. We'll speak about things like the dawning of the Age of Aquarius. But to first speak about precession of the equinoxes, it's the so-called third motion of the Earth. So astronomy 101, right? We know about the spin of the Earth, the diurnal motion, which means daily, 24 hours for an Earth spin. And that brings us, of course, day. I can even use this light here, right? This would be noon in Africa, and that's sunrise, or I guess that was South America, whatever, sunrise elsewhere. So 24 hours brings us the day, the spin of the Earth. Then we know the Earth orbits the sun, my fist here being the sun, right? In 365.24 days and change, that is the year, right? The second motion of the Earth. Because the Earth's axis is tilted, we also have seasons as we're orbiting the Earth. And we're not going to get so deep into that today, but most of you probably know this with your basic astronomy. But the so-called third motion of the Earth is attributed in the current astronomical teachings as a so-called wobble of the Earth's axis. That while the Earth is spinning in a day, while the Earth is orbiting in a year, this axis, the northern side here, the North Pole, points at the North Star, which is currently Polaris. But not always, because over about 26,000 years, as currently taught, there is this very slow backwards to the direction of the spin wobble of the Earth's axis. And one thing this does is has our pole pointing to different stars over time. So we'll move on from this cat who ought to know better that there's 12 and move into this image now, which is the potential pole stars during the course of the precessional cycle. And cycle is a very important word here because it is cyclic. It's not linear. And in fact, this speaks to another energy or another period of time. Plato called this the Great Year. And it's often been associated with a 25,920 year time frame for the Earth's axis. This is the north axis, currently points, or I'd like to call it the spine of Gaia, currently points to Polaris. So as the Earth spins, we see all of the stars in the sky orbiting or rotating or revolving around this star Polaris. When you see those images of many concentric circles of stars, it is in northern hemisphere Polaris that's in the center. But Polaris, which is one of the most accurate pole stars of all time, and that's wonderful that we live at this time, is not always our pole star. Precession of the equinoxes will have the North Pole shifting through these many stars over time. Daniel, do you want to add anything about that?
Well, one thing, if you look at this diagram while it's up here, you'll see there's this right in the smack in the middle of the circle is labeled ecliptic pole. So that's actually over 26,000 years. It's the average of all the points. I mean, it is the actual pole itself. And you'll notice that the dragon, Draco, some like to call it Draco, and then also the Greeks also had stories where they used the name Ladon, L-A-D-O-N, is another name of this serpent, snake, dragon. The thing I love about this is that how it's actually encircled around the center of the circle. So it's not entwined around Polaris, it's not entwined around the North Star 13,000 years ago, which was where Vega was relatively close. Or if you go back 18,000 years when Deneb would have been the closest bright star to North. But actually, it's the dragon, the great dragon that guards the world tree, is encircled around the center of the ecliptic pole. I don't know. I just think that's really cool. And we very much use this imagery in the school that the Earth, Gaia, is a living being. And so this could actually be seen as the Kundalini snake around the axis of the living being Gaia. And then over a period of time, all of these different stars that you can see here on the diagram, that North will point to those constellations and those stars. You'll notice something extremely fascinating, and it may come up later in our conversation, is there's only one time period in the 26,000 year wobble, that the Milky Way itself is close to north, which is a very interesting time period in history when this whole area of where the Milky Way comes through will be aligned with north, and that's not close to the time we're in now. That you have to kind of go back to the middle of the Ice Age when that was the case. And the books like the Cygnus Mystery, the work of Andrew Collins and others, has been referencing what humanity was up to at that particular time when Deneb was the North Star.
Right, and remember Daniel just said that Deneb was the North Star 17,000, 18,000 years ago, and here we see 10,000 AD, right? Yes. So 8,000 years from now, because 18,000 years ago plus 8,000 years from now is 26,000, or the time of the entire cycle. I can't pass the synchronicity, Daniel. I recorded a reading today for a woman named Margaret, and I was called to research the etymology of that name before I hit go. And it comes from a Greek word, pearl, and maybe from a Sanskrit word that means the same. And this woman's Catholic, so I decided to image this through the Catholic mysteries, though I'm not from inside that place. But there was a Saint Margaret, and she's often associated with dragons. And I think often when I look at Draco or Draco here, we often see, like in the Chinese imagery, that dragon that holds the ball. And I'm thinking of it now as holding this pearl in those little arms, you know. Mm-hmm. So there's a time where Thuban, said to be the heart of the dragon, is the North Star. And this was about 5,000 years ago. And if you know anything about Serpent Mound in Ohio, it seems to speak to the time when Thuban was the North Star. It's not the only sacred place in the world. And I'd refer you to Ross Hamilton's work if you want to further that pursuit in Serpent Mound and Precession. But it's this place here, which in a way is never north, but it's the north of north. Because as Daniel mentioned, it's the ecliptic pole, the center of all the potential norths over the entire 26,000 year cycle. And therefore, you'll see in the esoteric mysteries, as I often have, images of the dragon to represent north. We've shared in our eclipse video how the dragon also can speak about the moon and the nodes and the sun, but the dragon comes to us in many ways.
Well, one thing, since we're on this track right now, it also turns out that in one of the source books that I use when I teach people about precession, is a very little known book called The Myth of Replacement by Thomas Worthen. It's a follow-up to Hamlet's Mill, and in it he talks about the 11th labor of Hercules, and in the 11th labor of Hercules is given the task of slaying the snake that does not sleep, that guards the world tree, and that was Ladon. That was Draco. And so his task, you can see there was a political and economic agenda to it, because to get the age of Taurus to change to the age of Aries, the way they understood that was that you had to kill the dragon that does not sleep, that guards the world tree, as if you killed that snake, then you could turn it into a different age. Of course, we now know over a period of time that dragon is always there guarding the world tree. It cannot really be entirely and completely slain, even though they tried to show that Gilgamesh and Hercules, Gilgamesh is kind of like a later Babylonian, Sumerian version of Hercules, where it had the same task, to overthrow the matriarchy. But that was the Ladon who's guarding the world tree. So I just think that's something to remember every time you see the dragon in the sky, what its job is.
Absolutely. And the dragon that guarded the golden fleece in the story of Jason and the Argonauts, also a story that brings in this imagery of the transition from the age of the bull to the age of the ram. So what is this age of Taurus and this age of Aries? And we'll get to that. But to know that this, in so many ways, is the world tree. Yeah, as I like to say, the spine of Gaia, this axis of Earth that points south and points north, always, no matter where we are in the cycle. The deal is that it's pointing at different places. So I'll share my screen again. And
yeah, the thing that's so cool there is that if you see that as the world tree, and then also the other traditions like the Mayan and so on that would see the Milky Way as the world tree, can you imagine then how powerful an image it is if you have the Milky Way in alignment with the north-south world tree?
right, in a sense, the terrestrial tree and the celestial tree aligning to one another. And there's times where that happens, as Daniel mentioned before. We can have a North Star. Deneb is the closest. Vega is also close, where our axis, our earthly world tree, is pointing to this Milky Way, the celestial world tree. And then there's other times of this cycle, now being one of the very significant ones, when Daniel is attacked by a flying scorpion.
What was that? That's pretty strange.
That's Manila magic. And when the world tree of the celestial realms, maybe galactic center, comes to us at one of the solstice points, or what I could say is like the bendings of Earth's nodes, and I'll say what I mean by that. So there's another book that Daniel hipped me to as far as precession goes. That's called When the Dragon Wore the Crown by Don Thoreau, and that will be in the links that we share below. But I'm going to take us to Stellarium once again, and I'm going to turn us towards the north. And this is Polaris. This is the North Star. Tell you a secret, if I look at the altitude of the North Star, 48 degrees, well, that's because here in Seattle, I'm at 48 degrees latitude. The latitude or the altitude of the North Star for you in the Northern Hemisphere will always be the latitude where you are in the Northern Hemisphere. But if I play this through time now, what we will see is all of the stars revolving around Polaris. Now, Polaris is not exactly north, but it is dang close, as you can see here. The South Hemisphere does not currently have a South Star. They have what I call the South Pole space. But what's very important is that Polaris, if you get to know it, it will teach you the directions. If you face Polaris here with your body, and put your hands out to your side, then your right hand will be pointing east and your left hand will be pointing west. And when we talk about the changing of the ages, this is what becomes very important, because this ecliptic, which is the plane of Earth's orbit about the sun, and if we project that way out into space, what we find is the constellations of the zodiac that do align to the signs, but not Lion as Leo, and that's why Shamanic Astrology teaches us to call this Lion and this Priestess or Virgin instead of Virgo, and we'll get back to that. But this is curved in the sky. It's not the horizon. It is in very certain places at certain times because the Earth is tilted on its axis. There's one more curve that I will bring in here, which is called the celestial equator, Earth's equator projected out into space. This is this blue line. And there's two places where these two circles will cross. This is one of them here. And this is the autumnal equinox point. And what I'll show you is that if I move through time here, that crossing point of ecliptic and equator will set due west. This is the 0 Libra point. And it is not in the constellation of the scales that we tend to associate with the Libra mysteries. It is in our time here, very close to the neck of the priestess. On the opposite side, and this is the vernal equinox point, or I should say the March equinox point, because it's different in the two hemispheres as we know. This point here, which has traditionally been known as the vernal equinox point, but the March equinox point is the other place where the galactic, or the terrestrial equator, celestial equator, crosses the ecliptic. And it's currently aligned here in the sign of, the constellation of the fishes. If I go back, 2,000 years, what you'll see is that this curve, or this intersection of the two curves, is now earlier in the fish. And if I go, let's say, 1,000 years before that, you'll find it aligned to the ram. And what I want you to know is that at that time, Polaris was not the North Star. At that time, and I can just see, if I look north and I let this thing spin a little bit, what we'll see is that it's somewhere in this zone, yeah? So if north has shifted, then our arms, one facing east and one facing west, are going to be pointing at different constellations or different fabric in the heavens, right? So at this time, I'm at 1,000 years BE or before Common Era. It's here with the Ram. I'll go back, well, let's say couple thousand years, 2,100 years before then, and you'll see it aligned to the constellation of the Bull. Now, it is the vernal equinox point or the March equinox point that we as astronomers, astrologers, track the ages of astrology, we could say. So back here, 3000 BC, we were in the age of the Bull with that equinox point aligned to the Bull. And precession has it moving backwards. Precession means a backwards motion. So it's going to move from the Bull to the Ram, then to the Fish. There's a video I'll show here, and Daniel and I in our first episode, we spoke about Göbekli Tepe, and we mentioned Graham Hancock's book, Magician of the Gods. And Graham works hand in hand with this man, Randall Carlson, at that time. I mentioned my recent sacred geometry study. That started at Randall's site, which is Sacred Geometry International. And I'm going to share this video here, which is Randall's Cosmic Patterns and Cycles of Catastrophe. I really highly recommend you pick this up. You can find it at sacredgeometryinternational.com. It's a brilliant video that speaks about a lot more than just precession, but I'll show you this bit of precession here. And so what we see is as that North Pole points at different stars, the east and west points are going to precess through the signs and through the constellations of the zodiac, right? So this would be the age of the lion, and actually it's this point I want to look at, the age of the archer, the age of Sagittarius, the age of Scorpio, the age of Libra would be next. So procession is a forward march, right? Precession is a backward movement. And so we move from the age of the bull to the age of the ram. We see images of Mithra slaying the bull or the dragons that Daniel and I mentioned before. Biblically speaking, we could say that after Moses, we're told, received the commandments, thou shalt not kill. Well, on line number 1 is thou shalt have no false idols above me. And Moses, who is of the shepherds, think ram, comes down from Mount Sinai and slays 3,000 of his people because they're worshiping a golden bull, golden calf. So now we're talking again about this shift mythologically from the age of the bull to the age of the ram. A couple thousand years later, there's the Son of God, this Lamb of God, the Good Shepherd is born, but he becomes the Fisher King. Yeah? So from the age of the ram to the age of the fish. All right. So I want to show another thing here because you see this imagery often in many of the Christian iconography. This is an image from Chartres Cathedral in Paris. And what you see is here the Son of Man, as he called himself, inside the Vesica Pisces. And he's surrounded by bull and lion and eagle and angel. And you can see him pointing to the angel. Well, astrologically, we call these the fixed signs or the cross quarter point signs. The bull, Taurus, the lion, Leo, the eagle associated with Scorpio, and the angel or the human associated with Aquarius. There's this thing in the big book, behold, when ye are entered into the city, there shall a man meet you bearing a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house where he entereth in. And whoever put this up, I love because they highlight a man bearing a pitcher of water and they highlight house, which is often associated with this astrological signs. Here is the man bearing the pitcher of water. And we're speaking here about the dawning into the age of Aquarius. So cue the hare song. And one of the great questions is, well, when is that going to go down? So if I open Stellarium here one more time, what I'll show, if I bring back in the celestial equator and we look at that intersection point of ecliptic and equator to find the current vernal equinox point, which is here with the fish, okay? And I don't need to wait for the sun to rise at that point around March 20th, March 21st every year. I mean, I can show that. That's when the sun is there. But if I try to see which constellation the sun is rising in at the vernal equinox, good luck, because I'm not going to see those constellations with the sun in the way. But what's more brilliant is later in the year, you'll notice, once you get to know the sky, that the zodiac or the ecliptic is not always rising due east. Let's just move through a day. It only rises due east twice a day. And here is that vernal equinox point rising. So if you know the stars of the ecliptic, the stars of the zodiac, you can get to know, if you know due east, when it rises due east, and that is the vernal equinox point, if it's coming from the south back to due east. And so here we are, dawning into the age of Aquarius. Well, what's the problem? We have this intersection point well aligned to this head of the fish. In fact, I'm going to have to go about 1,000 years into the future to see that starting to shift over here towards this constellation of the water bearer, maybe even 4,000 AD. And now it's well in that place of the water bearer. But as Daniel mentioned before, the water bearer does not necessarily start right here or start at the water. Here he's shown backwards. Here is that, again, the current vernal equinox point aligned to the head of the fish, but see how close it is to the water bearer here. And if I get into this astronomical convention since the 30s, as Daniel mentioned, of how the constellations have been divided in the sky, and we look over here to the constellation Aquarius, see Ophiuchus is trying to creep in, but he's not grayed out in this image for a zodiacal constellation. We'll look at how Aquarius has this strange geometry. And here's another image of it. And here's one that's really helpful, I think, where we see that Aquarius, as far as how the IAU is blocked out, the 88 constellations and the 12 constellations of the zodiac, look where it begins, actually around this head of the fish. So part of the issue here of, have we dawned into the age of Aquarius? Are we dawning into the age of the Aquarius? Will it be another 1,000 or 2,000 years before the sun rises here on vernal equinox? It depends where you start and where you create your boundaries of the constellations. But one thing is for sure, is that we are in a time of galactic alignment. And before I turn this back over to Daniel, I will say, this is a wonderful book by John Major Jenkins, a Mayan scholar. He brings forth mysteries from the Mayan tradition, Vedic tradition, Egyptian tradition, as you can read here. I really highly recommend it. I read this before I came onto astrology, before I met Daniel. That was the same time. And when I read it again after meeting Daniel, I really loved seeing that in the preface that John Major Jenkins speaks about Daniel having been the first astrologer who brought awareness to this idea of galactic alignment. And I'll just show this image here really quick of Hamlet's Mill before I ask you, Daniel, how did you come on to galactic alignment?
So I've been involved in astrology since 1969. It was 1969, 1970s, when a lot of us back in the day were very inspired by the book Hamlet's Mill. And it turns out that in Hamlet's Mill is the very first time in print any reference was made to the events that we're leading up to here, which is when you have this alignment between the plane of the solar system, the plane of the galaxy, and then you have a solstice sun aligning with that a point where they come together. It's brought up in that book, but there's way more about that book that inspired a lot of us. I always like to say when the subject of that book comes up that it's really Hertha von Dechand who should be getting the credit. It's her theories that form the background of that whole telling. And what is the thesis of it? That the way culture operates, the way mythology operates, the way that ceremony takes place over time is inspired by the cosmology. That it's the cosmological experience with our senses of what we see in the sky over time that actually informs how culture develops. So we followed up on that. And I was involved in a form of astrology following Dane Rajar all through the 70s, which was not experiential per se. But then after having a vision quest in the early 1980s, I decided to have my whole practice be about the experience of the sky. And so as the 1980s transpired, there was myself and one other astrologer, who the two of us were like voices crying in the wilderness. That was Marduk's. And the two of us talked about about how to bring astrology back to its experience with the sky. And we spent a huge amount of time under the sky learning how astrology works with the direct experience of the stars and the constellations and the planets and so on. And it was all during the 80s that we began to be, we tried to figure out a way to have a conversation about what was very popular at that time, which was, when is the beginning of the Age of Aquarius? And that was like a big topic. And there were, at one point I did some research on it, and there's like 50 different solutions. And as you had presaged just a few minutes ago, that it depends on what you determine to be the beginning point and the end point of the constellational group. That's if you're using the constellation. Now, there's been other approaches as far as dividing the sky up. We finally reached the point, and it was really great to come up to this point where to try to determine when the beginning and the end, or the end and the beginning of the Age of Aquarius is. It's a moot point. It doesn't matter if you find a larger framework in order to understand how the cosmology operates over time. So all these books written about it. I mean, Rajar at one point writes, the Age of Aquarius begins when the sign of Virgo begins to overlay Regulus, which turned out to be 2011, based upon I think he wrote 2012, which was the calculations they had at that particular point. Numerous other people had different ideas. I even found at one point, I was led into a library in Nevada City, California, which was filled with books from the 1920s. And there were at least 5 volumes that had to do with the Age of Aquarius beginning in the 1920s. And that was following up on the Steiner work and the work that came from the Alice Bailey School that had to do with when the Age of Aquarius would begin. But by the time we started working with the night sky and seeing this other phenomena called the Galactic Alignment, the whole issue of the Age of Aquarius beginning or ending becomes a moot point. And that also includes the issue, and this is something that I popularized at that time period, which was, if you only talk about the Age of Aquarius and not the other 3, then you are an Aquarian age chauvinist. Or you could say you're a spring equinox chauvinist, because it's really the solstices and the equinoxes is 4 points, and the understanding of the 4 points moving through the constellations, then you have a global transmission, not just a culture that's primarily oriented on the spring equinox only. We've had some private correspondences, you and I were, it's like to be able to see historically around the world when they begin New Year. Mm-hmm. And there's this assumption made that isn't it always spring equinox? Well, no, not really. I mean, it's just numerous ways in which cultures around the world have determined when New Year happens, whether it's the fall equinox, spring equinox. I mean, one of the ways the Babylonians distinguished them, the way the Jews said we're not Babylonians, is that they began to start their year at the fall equinox rather than the spring equinox. So that was their way of, but it still had to do with an equinox. But rather than making some kind of a point that New Year should be at a particular junction point, we decided maybe it's better to look at this globally. All 4 points are moving into different constellations.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it's happening at the same time. If you have a larger framework to perceive how the clockwork operates. And so is there a larger structure? Is there a scaffolding that you can actually more clearly see how the 26,000 year operates? And then you can divide it by 4. And then you can divide it by 12.
Yeah.
The 4 seasons and the 12 months. It was this discernment about the galactic alignment, which we call the turning of the ages in the school, which gave us that framework. And what's so strange, having been involved in this since the late 60s, early 70s, is that even Rajar did not know about this. I mean, the assumption was made at that point, well, when does the 26,000 year cycle end and begin? Well, probably when the Aries sign and the Aries constellation are lined up. I mean, that was what they thought, because they were not aware of this larger framework, as well as something we've discerned in the school about the real reason why they had to invent, the Hellenistic culture invented the seasonal zodiac in the first place. We'll get to that a little bit later. But back to the galactic alignment issue. If you are able to see the sky without light pollution, there is a fabulous larger structure in the sky. And that is the way in which the Milky Way, the plane of the galaxy, intersects with the plane of the solar system. And maybe you have some things to illustrate there, Brett.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll look to Stellarium and show these 2 crosses, because there's an Earth cross. Yeah, we see it in the medicine wheel, the 4 directions, and there's a cross of the heavens. And only every 6,480 years or so, which we could say is a season of the great year, do the 2 crosses align. And we are blessed to live in one of those times. And this is what Galactic Alignment is showing us. And I love you saying like the kind of equinox ego.
Equinox chauvinist.
Right, equinox chauvinist. And really that vernal equinox point where tropical Aries begins, that is the essence of East. And it's such an important essence. East is the rise. If you watch the sky will teach you this. No matter where you are in the earth, northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere, East is the rise, a place of new beginnings. Here in the northern hemisphere, south is the reach, where the sun and the moon and the planets culminate. That is, if you live above the Tropic of Cancer. I can't say that to Daniel because he's between the tropics now. West is the rest. And north is the roots, the only essence of the light you will ever see in the north, if you live in the northern hemisphere, is your shadow. And it takes you into the earth to see the sun through our great globe. Yeah. So we want to honor all of these directions of the earth cross. And so we'll see this in Stellarium, we'll see the celestial cross, and we can honor the earth cross as well. So Hamlet's Mill, again, is the place that first hipped Daniel to these mysteries. Here I am in Stellarium, and I'm at 2001 BC. And that's this time where really it was, in a sense, the dawning of the age of Aries, or of the Ram. And that's, again, a constellational boundary thing. Because this is a very important trip. Look at the size of the Ram compared to the size of the fish. The 12 signs of the constellations do not divide the ecliptic into 12 equal slices of 30 degrees. So one of the great mysteries of astrology is, well, where do you start the division of 12? And Western astrology, or tropical astrology, begins it here, begins it at the crossing point, which shifts. So the trip is that though we begin Aries at that so-called vernal equinox point, or March equinox point, it's not always aligned to the constellation of the Ram. And this is why the sun was not in the constellation traditionally associated with the sign at the time of your birth. So if I move this to, well, 1, we'll see that now that vernal equinox point shifting into the fish. And if I move it to 2012, or that's what first got me to explore these mysteries of galactic alignment and whatnot, we'll see that it's here towards the edge of this giant constellation of the fish, moving towards Aquarius, or the water bearer. But I'm going to take us back 4,000 years again, because now let's look at another one of the points. The Earth cross is easy to see. It is east, south, west, and north behind us on the screen right now. But what about 1221? Yeah, winter solstice time. And at this time, you will see that that winter solstice sun was aligned to the constellation of the sea goat, or as I like to say, the she goat. This is not true in our day. I'm going to move this to, well, let's do 1,000 years ago about. And we have that winter solstice sun now having precessed, or moving backwards through the constellations of the zodiac, because we know we go from sea goat to water bearer to fish. So this is a precession, or a backwards movement, where that winter solstice point shifts into the archer. And what about our time now? Let's just do 2012 for the novelty of the thing. There it is. The winter solstice sun aligned to the Milky Way and to galactic center, here where the Ouroboros of the serpent, the cosmic serpent, eats its own tail, a place the Mayans called Hunahpu. And very importantly, I'll zoom out here, and let's just go to a different time. We'll get the sun out of the mix. We can see that where the Milky Way, which is our galaxy, crosses the ecliptic plane, which is our solar system, this is one of the celestial crossing points Daniel is speaking about. In some of the mystery traditions, as Daniel taught me, this was called the Golden Gate. And on the opposite side of the sky, the Silver Gate, exactly away from the center of the galaxy. So if you look here, specifically towards El Nath, which is this horn of the bull, and into this zone of the zodiac, a very important place to so many of the global mysteries, called by the Lakota the sacred hoop, or the racetrack. This is galactic anticenter, and it is the other place in the sky where the Milky Way, or our galaxy, crosses the solar system, as shown by the ecliptic. And in our time, and this I find to be very important and not often discussed in the galactic alignment mysteries, we also have our summer solstice. Here I'm at June 21st, aligned to the sacred hoop, aligned to that other cross of the celestial. So winter solstice and summer solstice, respectively south and north, we could say, brings the alignment of the sun to, on the cross of earth, to the cross of the sky. And very importantly here, as Daniel will tell us about, the sun on the hand of the high man.
Well, one of the other resources that'll be on the reading list for this show is the work from Ireland of Anthony Murphy, The Island of the Setting Sun and New Grange Monument to Immortality. And that has to do where I got this information originally, regarding the way they look at the galactic edge there. By the way, you said the astronomer's term is galactic anti-center rather than galactic center, but we've tended to use the expression edge, because when you look at that part of the sky, you're looking out into deep space, outside of the galaxy. You're looking toward the edge of the galaxy, while the other point is toward the galactic center, which is where the December solstice is now. So if we're looking at this as a global issue, a global framework, the December solstice, not summer, winter, the December solstice is at the galactic center, while the June solstice is at the galactic edge. And it's just remarkable how when the sun now, during this time period, just this one time period, like, once every 26,000 years or once every 13,000 years at a solstice. The solstice is right on the hand. the outstretched hand of what we would call Orion, which in Ireland is Cayelin. And even later, St. Patrick was superimposed on that star group. You know, it was just like this great figure holding the sun. And in their transmission, whenever the sun would be at a different point there, it marked the turning of an age. The Beltane sun was on the high hand when the Celtic patriarchal culture came and overran the Tuatha De Danann. Well, 6,500 years ago is the megalithic age, when they built the stuff, you know, when there was a whole different transmission happening. And now they have the same view that we're entering into a completely different time period in history at the turning of the ages. Before I forget, you did put up 2012 as part of Stellarium. What actually, the thing that actually sparked John Major Jenkins' interest in what I had done is that it came from my own correspondence with an astronomer to do the calculations as to when the precise exact point would be of when the solstice, the December solstice, was on the cross. What cross am I talking about? The cross of where the galactic equator and the plane of the solar system intersect. Fixed points. They don't change over time. Or we could say that 200,000 years of human beings have essentially the same DNA. There hasn't been a change in that perception, the way we see that structure on the sky, the way in which the two crosses operate in the sky. So what we're seeing in this time period, and the astronomer Jean Muse did this calculation, and put it in one of his books, which was that point was May 1998, the center point. Now the other astrologer that I mentioned, we were both doing this research back in the 1980s. He recently corresponded with me and said that no, his calculations now say that it was 1994 and 1998, but that still is pretty close. And so if we use the 72 year, 1 degree equals 72 years, you could put 36 years, it's just one way of doing it. You could put 36 years on either side of 1994, and that would be the zone, if we have one lifespan, you know, that the zone of the big turning of the ages that we're in is 36 years on either side of 1994. So, you know, we're kind of right in the middle of it.
Right, yeah, and I want to get back to the 72 in a second. First, my apologies to our Southern Hemisphere amigos for being Northern Hemisphere chauvinist, speaking from my own experience, so I shall not cast stones. But yeah, it's hard to remember to say December solstice and June solstice because, of course, our winter solstice is the Southern Hemisphere's summer solstice. And, you know, it's an important point that we kind of touched before of this galactic alignment and how the alignment's happening not only at the December solstice, but also at the June solstice. It's just one is at galactic center and one is on the galactic edge. Daniel mentioned before our ongoing talk and educating me about these many cultures around the world where they start their year. The other side of that is when do you start the day? So some have started at sunrise. Some begin at sunset. Yeah. Yes. And we begin in the middle of the night. It's a kind of a crazy thing, isn't it, for us to begin the day when we are in the darkest hour. But it is at that time when the sun has promised it will rise again. And it begins to come up to find its rise from the roots, its rise in the east. So this is similar to our current calendar where we begin on January 1st, so close to the winter solstice for the Northern Hemisphere, the longest night. Again, we begin our year so close to this time where we are in the darkest hour. And I find it to be a very important thing. And it really brings our consciousness to this December solstice place. And the importance now that, in a way, the December solstice sun, which is the birth of the sun, yeah? And sing a Christmas tune. This is when the sun is promised to bring the return of the light from the longest night, in the Northern Hemisphere anyway, and now it's aligned to this place of the galactic center. So many of we astrologers know galactic center as 27-ish degrees of Sagittarius. And it's just important, I think, to share in that regard that that's because the center of the galaxy is not on the ecliptic. It's slightly above the ecliptic. So when it projects down, it's not there. But we do know that in our time, it is the December solstice sun that is aligned to galactic center. And I can bring this back to 1994. The sun is about half a degree, visibly speaking, and it's going to be at galactic center for some time. You go 1,000 years ago, and here it is very far away, yeah? So if I just keep this at winter solstice and cruise through time, here we're in 1,000. I don't know that this is going to go fast enough. And it's hard to see, but it takes a long time for the sun to make this movement over about 26,000 years, or it's often taught 25,920 years for the sun to make this alignment. We saw that jump there, which was from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar. But here we are at the galactic center time, really coming up even in the early 1900s and certainly now. And what John Major Jenkins shows in Galactic Alignment is that 2012, from his point of view, seems to be the center point of this perhaps 36 or even 72-year time frame.
He actually uses a diagram that shows the center point 1998, and so that it's actually moving away by 2012.
Yeah,
that's
well,
what
I think he changed it in this book after Maya Cosmogenesis, but it's and we know that it's happening right now. There's one more thing that I would share from the biblical prophecies, which is this. Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" He says, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Well, if you've been out under the dark sky, and we very much encourage you to, you know the clouds of heaven. It's the Milky Way. It literally looks like clouds. And it crosses right here, one place, the Silver Gate, the galactic edge, right above the hand of the Mighty One, Orion, the hand of the High Man. I want to show this image of Hunab-Ku, so many windows. The Mayans had this image that some in modern times have called the galactic butterfly for galactic center. Now we know that there is a supermassive black hole, and many thought it's the sun of our sun, that which our entire solar system is orbiting over like 242 million years, I think is the current number. The galactic center is a supermassive black hole. And this is how the Mayans drew that place of the sky, which they called Hunab-Ku or Ishtapa. And I'm told this means grandmother, grandfather who created us and feeds us with their light. You can see this vortex kind of black hole image here. And it's even like black hole, white hole. I find that to be very significant. And in so many of the global mysteries, this sacred place of the sky, the galactic center, was honored as a place that our souls will go to as we finish a lifetime. And I think that's important. I don't know that I'll share in this episode many of these places, but it's important for us to speak about precession because as Daniel and I go on, it's kind of a prerequisite for a lot of our sharings and a lot of our study in the Shamanic Astrology Mystery School, in alternative history and otherwise.
It's possible we could maybe summarize what we've talked about so far if you can put up the logo.
Sure. Yeah, let me share the screen and I will try to find that. Here's the logo on the cover of the Shamanic Astrology Handbook. And here we will zoom into a bit. Let me see if I can get our cameras out of the way.
So one of the things that might be useful to talk about here is because there's a great deal of confusion, misunderstanding about this issue. What is the relationship between a sign and a constellation? We've gone through several things here to show how they're not the same thing, but what really is their relationship with each other? For a long period of time, there was just sidereal zodiacs. I mean, it started with the lunar mansion system of the movement of the moon through 27 and a small 28th portion of the sky. And then there were only the Babylonian and Vedic sidereal zodiacs. Usually the stories that were told about those star groups had to do with a seasonal phenomena. You know, that's when the scorpions are on the land, or, you know, that's the rising of the waters. There's generally a seasonal phenomena that was what was projected onto the star group. But over a period of time, it turns out that the stories didn't work because the constellations showed up at the wrong seasons. Something needed to be done about this, and it was the Hellenistic culture that had the fabulous idea to come up with an alternative or an additional zodiac, which was based upon the seasons themselves. I love what you mentioned earlier on, Brett, that working this whole understanding that it's really an Earth phenomenon. The signs are an emanation of our Earth. It's not from the stellar dimension. Years ago, the way we tried to understand this, the way we tried to explain this was that it's like the relationship between spirit and soul. The star groups are spirit and the signs are soul. Father sky, mother earth. It's like sort of this duality between something coming from the stellar dimension and something coming from our earth herself. So that they created a system, essentially an archetype in and of itself, the zodiac archetype, which is based upon the way they understood seasons. So you have like 12 by 30, and what makes you an Aries is that it's the first 30 days after the spring equinox. But that's what it is. It has nothing to do with any star group. But over long periods of time, and this is what is represented in this logo, and what we would need to have at some point is some movable set of wheels here on the logo, but it's showing how the constellation informs the sign. And a lot of people don't understand this, but that actually even in Ptolemy school 2,000 years ago, they knew the difference between the two zodiacs. Actually, they created the tropical zodiac so they could have a relationship with the star groups. So certainly they knew about both of them. And the question in the school was, what is the proportion by which the constellation informs the sign? We have a description here of what I'm talking about. So here we have on the logo, we have the sign on the outside, Pisces, like Pisces, Aries. And then we have the name is associated with the star group to the right. So we have water bear and fish, goatfish. I think that Brett and I have talked about this, where he kind of likes sea goat. I've always liked goatfish, but we're talking about the same figure there. It's a very ancient image. And so that we have now the goatfish lined up with the sign of Aquarius. We have the archer lined up with the sign of Capricorn.
And this is why you'll see this symbol that we tend to associate with Capricorn, not aligned to Capricorn, the sign, but aligned to Aquarius, the sign, because of precession. I just want to add, for those of you who don't know about the sidereal zodiac, some astrologies, popularized today mostly by the Jyotish tradition, which we call the Vedic tradition, they begin their zodiac with the stars. And if you think about this in a way, because it's up and out, it's kind of the yang imagery, all right? Mm-hmm. Where the tropical zodiac, the seasonal zodiac it's called, but because of the polarity of seasons from north and south hemispheres, I've come to call it the directional zodiac. And I plan to show how it begins with the tilt axis of the earth sometime. But we begin Aries with the equinox point, yeah? And because of precession, Aries, being March and April, will slowly shift backwards through the constellational groups, which is why in our day and age, Aries is aligned to the fish and not the ram. And 2,000 years ago, or from now, it will be aligned to the water bearer, not the fish. And it's going to take 26,000 years about to make the whole trek. And it's interesting because we will have, as tropical astrologers, this shift where your sign remains the same in March or April or whatever, but it's shifting through the constellations, where the sidereal folks who begin with a star, and I believe it's this one, Spica, they will have their sun for a sign still aligned to the same constellation, even 10,000 years from now, but it will be in a different season. So sidereal Northern Hemisphere Leo will eventually be in the winter, not the summer.
Right.
And so we want to honor both of those. And there's also, because these constellations are different sizes, there's also a third zodiac, which is the constellational zodiac. And I love myself as a proof, not just because of my ego, but it happens to line up well. Because many will say, like I showed Stellarium for today, and the first degree of the Sagittarius sun is aligned to the Scorpion. Well, to convert your sun sign to Jyotish astrology, right now you subtract about 23.5, 24 degrees, all right? Mm-hmm. So they would say that, yes, just look, the sun's with the Scorpion. Of course, it's Scorpio, but we're working, again, tropically.
So yeah, the thing I wanted to get to here, Brett, was not just so you can see here how a particular constellational group is lined up and informing a sign, but the fact that we have developed this based upon the galactic alignment itself, which is then placing it 30 to 30 at this point. So this is why it is that this whole issue of when does the Aquarian age begin is moot. Because if we know we're in a constellation, in a seasonal boundary time, and that was, based on Marduk's calculation, 1994, Jean Muse's calculation, 1998. If we used a 1 degree every 72 years kind of criterion, 36 years on either side, this logo is calibrated now to the actual situation, which is aligning the months and the seasons with the actual seasonal shift that we've gone through. So that 23, 24 degree variation is not really valid if you're looking at this larger framework, which has to do with the seasonal shift aligned with the galactic crosses. Because it's the galactic crosses that actually become we could say the common denominator for all of it. Everything else operates off of that superstructure. And then there really only remains one other issue, that if we understand how this structure operates, how would you determine, if you could determine, is it the end of a season and the beginning of a season? Or is it the end and the beginning of the entire 26,000 year?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the correlations between the Mayan cycle, which speaks of 5 suns or 5 ages, and the Western tradition of 4 ages shows us that we are at the time of the beginning of the end of the beginning again, as I like to say. And I'll get right back to that, but I'll just encourage you that to see that this logo is an amazing tool. Okay, so I was born on October 24th, 1975, 7:39 p.m. Boston, Massachusetts. Now you know everything about me. But it's the first degree of Scorpio. Okay, so right here. And it's one thing I love to show sidereal astrologers who will say, no, you're Libra. You're like 7 degrees Libra because the sun was aligned to the Libra constellation. And I say, no, it wasn't. Actually, the sun was aligned right here in the skirts, we could say, of the priestess. So it's very interesting because on the tropical or seasonal or directional zodiac, I'm Scorpio. In the sidereal zodiac, I'm Libra. But constellationally speaking, I'm Virgo. So what the hell am I? Scorpio, Libra, or Virgo, and hence Gemini Brett. But, it's a really beautiful thing. If I open Stellarium one more time and we look at today. Okay, so again, today, November 21st, where I stand in Seattle, Washington. If I rewind here, the sun moved into Sag sometime around 1 p.m., I think. And I'll just move this. Let me go forward a few days if my computer will stop freaking out. And it seems like it won't. All right. I'll go to like November 23rd, 25th. So we know we're definitely in Sagittarius. But look at here is the sun aligned to the Scorpion and the claws of the Scorpion. Go a little further. Let's go into the beginning of December. And the sun is here aligned to Antares, the heart of the Scorpion. And so we will tell you that this is tropical or seasonal, directional Sagittarius. And yet aligned to this beautiful star Antares, and aligned to this wonderful constellation Scorpius, or the Scorpion. And this is why in Shamanic Astrology in the Mystery School, we don't call this Scorpio. We'll call this Sagittarius, but it is also Scorpion. And Daniel's saying such an important point that we only tap into when we look into the sky. Well, what is it that Sagittarius at this time, December 1st, 2016, what is it that it's a Scorpius Sagittarius or a Scorpion Sagittarius? Because if I move forward a couple thousand years, all right, that same December 1st time is going to be a Scales Sagittarius. And this is a very important question in the Mystery School about how much the constellation informs the sign.
Well, I mean, I could just myself as an example is that I'm by signs, I have a 23-degree Libra rising. But that happens to actually be right near the center of the body of the priestess and the star Spica. Now, in my own life, the transmission that has come through the priestess constellation and the most sacred star of the sacred feminine, I mean, that's my whole life has been about the matrilineal traditions and honoring the certain aspects of the feminine, and that does not come from the sign Libra. So it's like the combination of the transmissions that come from the Virgin Priestess constellation through Libra. And this is something we investigate. It's like we still don't know the answer to the Ptolemaic school's question. What is the proportion by which the constellation informs the sign? But catch this, and this is really the key to the whole mystery. Over a period of 26,000 years, every constellation has a chance to be with every sign. So there's the constant mixture. It's like the way that mythic stories, archetype, cultural stories, philosophies, different spiritual traditions, the way that happens over time can be seen by the way that every constellational group has an opportunity to make its transmission to every sign. So just one quick example, back in the age of Taurus, not the sign, but the constellation of the bull, the sign of Aries would have a different essence when the bull is behind it than if the sign of Aries has the fish behind it or has the water bear behind it. This is how this larger mythic unfoldment of how archetype and culture and the whole thing changes over time. It's right there in the heavens, based on the way in which these two zodiacs operate with each other. One other point I just thought of based on your sharing there, Brett, it's kind of one of the shadow aspects, not shadow, but it's like something I don't want to talk about so much, is the sidereal, like say the Jyotish people, we are using the stars. Well, not necessarily, because they're still dividing the star groups into 30-degree portions. And as you were indicating, like in your own example, that it's cutting the sky up arbitrarily into 30-degree portions. So you're not necessarily in the star group that they say you're in. And that's just another one of those things nobody really wants to talk about. But anyway, what we are trying to do, and maybe this is this would be where we're looking at the larger purpose of a conversation like this. and I think you're certainly, Brett, on board for this. In some ways, the project of the Shamanic Astrology Mystery School is to assist in building a foundation for the astrology that will work for the next age, which is combining the best of the traditions of the past, having a global orientation, blending the best of all the different zodiacal systems, but in a way that is really useful and practical for the people on the planet today. So we're building a foundation for the astrology of the future, a global grand synthesis.
Right, by remarrying astrology to astronomy. This is why I'm so called to the Shamanic Astrology Mystery School, why I'm so blessed to have gotten my start with Daniel. Our school looks up. And this is where so much of the information comes from, the direct transmissions. It's hard to rectify this thing that my Scorpio sun is not aligned to the Scorpion constellations. And I think many astrologers, because that is happening, just say, I don't want to look. Right? I don't want to look at that which I can't explain. Many wonder, is Vedic right or is Western right? Well, they're very different rule-based, and actually they both work just as the many different paradigms of Western astrology or Jyotish astrology or Chinese astrology can work for you and can help you know yourself, which is what we're doing here as healers of the starry cloth. But just as we started this episode with this whole 13th sign shenanigan, there's an invitation here to look up into something even more mysterious. So my Scorpio sun happens to be aligned to the priestess, and it won't be. And it wasn't 500 years ago, and it won't be in a couple thousand years. And that is something that I can integrate in my own being. What does it mean that the very beginning of Scorpio is now moving into this priestess territory? And Virgo is the largest constellation, so it's going to be there for a while. And see, in a way, then I get to join this group of cusper Scorpios who are at the head of this movement to move into the dress of the priestess. I have a hard time saying that without busting a Scorpio joke, so I won't. But it's a very powerful thing. What about these so-called fixed stars? What about that December 1st, 2016 sun we were just looking at aligned to Antares, such a powerful star? And as you start engaging with the up and out, like, do you know where Mars was when you were born? In the heavens, you see, because for the Martian essence, there's the sacred masculine essence or that outward force that Mars is, if you want to align your intentions or prayers to that, there is a weave in the fabric of the heavens that held Mars at the time of your first breath. And that is a place to connect to that essence within you.
Yep.
So a thing I would share too, just to speak about, well, are we in a season? Is this the beginning of the year? That kind of thing. If I go back to this brilliant video by Randall Carlson here, and we'll see him showing this cross. Really wonderful thing. And it shows bull and water bearer and scorpion and lion. But he's also going to show this correlation to the year and the great year. And further along, he shows you some of the sacred numbers and the platonic solids and everything. I don't want to just take all of Randall Carlson's work, and I really encourage you to buy this video or to check it out. It's actually on YouTube, but if you watch it for free, please also support him. He's a great teacher. But I think what's really important is that when so many of the Western mysteries have this 4 ages, we hear about the Golden Age and the Silver Age and the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, for example. Well, for the Mayans, there were 5 suns or 5 ages. And the long count calendar, which is basically where the Zolkin 260-day sacred calendar and the Hab, the 360 yearly calendar, line up. And it takes about 5,120 years for this to go down. So 5,120 times 5 gets us very close to the current accepted precessional great year of around 26,000 years. So if we divide it by 4 and they divide it by 5, well, there are only one place. If you divide a circle by 4 and by 5, there's only one place where a square and a pentagram can line up. So it's got to be one of these seasons. And given the attention that is given to the galactic center by the Mayans themselves, in the Western traditions, by the Celts, by the Lakota, by the Hopi, all around the world, it does seem to be the beginning right now. And it will be seen in future episodes. We'll probably talk about times where there's been a turning of the ages, as Daniel has come to call this time now, where it was a global catastrophe. Randall speaks about this in his video. Or a time where there was a of consciousness. And I think we're in a place right now where we can go either way with it. And I will say, while that tidal wave that was promised by the Hollywood movie billboards of 2012 didn't come in my reality, I certainly had a huge death and rebirth. I mean, for heaven's sake, I became an astrologer, and I always thought this thing was nonsense. So I imagine you too out there having some kind of strange awakening experience that's calling you to these mysteries, that you're becoming a mystic, that you're beginning to dance to the song of your soul. And it seems to be aligned to these prophecies of many traditions that this is the time for it to happen. And hopefully we will see this emanating out into the world at large.
I think we probably have taken people about as far as they can go today for one show, Brett. This is why it is in the school. This is taught over 5 days and 4 nights, with combination of in classroom and then going outside at night and then doing certain astro drama to play out some of it. Putting it into motion. It does take a while in order to ground this, and we did our best here to try to get a lot of it out here in a relatively short period of time. I just wanted to mention that the next time that in the Shamanic Astrology Mystery School we will be presenting the whole cosmology course is going to actually be at the megaliths of the southwestern portion of Portugal. And that's going to be next September, around the equinox, the fall equinox of September. We're going to be doing that for the full course under really beautiful skies and 6,000-year-old megaliths of the same tradition as the ones in Ireland and the Hebrides. It's the same people that were basically taking that around the world, around the coasts at that point. So that'll be the next time we offer this as a full course. I'm doing my best in the school to keep alive the gatherings in person. We're putting a lot of the stuff from the school online now. But I think it's really important to have a good number of days under the sky to really get it grounded. And I know that's what you're doing a lot of, is taking people out and getting them connected at sacred sites. And I think it's really important work. One thing I want to announce, and just kind of as a plug for the next show, what I'm hoping to do for our next show is to actually go over what our discoveries and our experiences were in Scotland and in Ireland over the last couple of years that we've done groups over there. What it's done is that it has galvanized in me why at this stage I'm really doing the work I'm doing. And this is so, I think, critical at this moment when people are going through a lot of emotional stuff regarding this last election we just had. And that is this reminder, and we can get this directly from our own experience, that for 200,000 years of history of us human beings on this planet being those that have the same DNA, it's only the last 4,000 or 5,000 years that it has been patrilineal, hierarchically patriarchal, monotheistic, and with an emphasis on domination and war. For a much longer period of time, our essence was Gialanic, land connected from a place of collaboration and cooperation. And we go to these sites to awaken within us what has been a much longer history of our own DNA that know this other way of being. And maybe it took the apparent triumph of the patriarchy yet again in order to fully illuminate in the brilliance of our awareness, including the richness of our DNA, that knows it's not true, to be able to wake us up the way that we need to be awakened at this time.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that so much. And not to get too political, I mean, when we speak about this rising and this awakening, it's like, well, then why this mess? You know?
Well, that's what I'm saying, is that it is sometimes, in order to wake people up, it's sort of a wake-up call to perceive that it's the last gasp.
Absolutely. And what we will see at this time is a purge. We will see the shadow rising to the surface. And it's a challenge for us to be able to hold center and not to point fingers and blame, but to see that darkness in ourselves, to heal ourselves, and then we heal the world. And I could speak about that all day, and I'll be
well, that's. I just wanted to say that was an additional point to as part of describing what the next show is going to be, which is a way of connecting to the renaissance of the sacred feminine.
Absolutely. And I'll just say that this is also part of the prophecies. And if you tune into what's happening at Standing Rock right now, for example, or the We Are Mauna Kea movement, you will know that we are rising as a people, returning to a natural way. And that being said, astrology is wonderful. In astrology, again, I've said this before, we're practicing correspondences, which is only half of astrology. The other half is astronomy. The hand in the glove, it's been said. And hopefully this is an invitation to you to study precession at length. There'll be a lot of links here below that you can further your investigation through, and to really invite you to re-engage with the living sky, as we will every time that we speak, because this is what we are so passionate about. Know your signs, know your aspects, know your stars. Because that other side of the thing, the above and the below, is what helps us meet in the middle. So have a reading with Daniel or another graduate of the Shamanic Astrology Mystery School, or with me, because we talk not only about signs, but also about constellations, and it's the other half of the thing, and it's so beautiful. And once again, Daniel, from my heart, thank you so much for tuning me to these mysteries and starting me on this quest that I guess began before you helped me understand that. But now that I know, I'm so devoted to it, and I really appreciate what you share with me, with the school, with everyone out here, and with the world. And thank you all for tuning in once again to the further adventures of Shamanic Astrology. For Daniel Giamario.
Thank you, Brett. We'll do it again. We'll do it again in about a month.
All right. Thank you all.
All right. See ya.